And hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special edition of Narrative Live. I'm in Toronto, and our very special guest from Kyiv is Yevgen Fichenko. How are you, Yevgen? Nice to see you tonight. Early morning there, I
Yeah,
should
good
say.
evening. Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yevgen is a very smart person. He's the PhD and a co-founder and chief editor of the fact-checking website stopfake.org. That's stopfake.org. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, he's also a former student of the man you see on the far right of your screen, Michael McKay, who's also in Canada, in Ottawa. Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm very well, Zeb. Good to see you.
Now, Michael's been here on the show before talking about all things Ukraine with us. And as we seem to be on the edge of all-out war in Ukraine tonight, we're back together with Michael, and glad to have Yevgen here to talk about the prospects of what's going on, but also to understand exactly how what's happening in Ukraine really does affect the United States and American politics going forward. But Yevgen, give us an update. What's going on right now in Ukraine?
So we are now at the moment when we talk about the escalation of the war, but actually the main point is that Ukraine is living with this war during the last 8 years, since 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine first and occupied first Crimea, and then part of Donbass, and now we have 7% of Ukraine's territory being occupied by Russia. So for us, it's not a new reality. We continue living in that. But now we also feel surrounded by Russian forces from all the sides, and that's bring kind of a new reality. But on another hand, I look at my fellow Ukrainians and I see how reserved they are, how prepared now they are, and of course there is a huge difference between now and 2014, when Ukraine was absolutely unprepared, absolutely kind of naive, unprepared both politically and militarily. So now we are in absolutely different position, and if we have the kind of new heat, new impact coming from Russian forces, we are much more prepared for that.
It is really important to underline the key point you're making there is that this has been going on for 8 years. So this is not new for Ukraine. Russia has been at war in Ukraine, slowly taking away territory on the eastern side for 8 years now. So this is an escalation, certainly, but it's not, as you point out, new for you guys at all. However, this situation is different because, on your borders now, there are 100,000 or 120,000 different Russian troops, apparently, and you're surrounded in some ways because you got Belarus now joining up with Russia. That's certainly changed the dynamics over there. It's a lot more complicated than it was in terms of the intensity of the conflict that could arise if all-out war does break out.
Yeah, exactly. It's very different situation on the ground now from military point of view. But again, if we would look at kind of wider political picture, we would see that this time it's not only about Ukraine. So now Russia basically is at the war with Europe and with the democratic world. And what they want to do, not only to basically deny Ukraine's right to exist, which is the bottom line of these movements against Ukraine per se, but also Russia wants to change Europe and the world from geopolitical point of view. They want to return to Yalta agreements, basically, and to new division in Europe, which did not happen since the end of World War II, and then since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So now we see that grand events happening, and Ukraine just happened to be in the middle of those events. So as to summarize, there are kind of two layers to that: the Ukrainian situation per se, and the stake is the Ukrainian survival of independent state. So it's an existential threat, and you're absolutely right. We are surrounded basically by Russia, but also Russia is blackmailing the world with occupying, with prospect of occupying Ukraine, and they want their demands to be seriously taken. And I'm very happy to see that it's a non-starter for the world to accept that and to negotiate, because if it's basically terrorist approach in international relations. You take hostages, and this hostage is Ukraine, and then you set up some demands, and then you demand the ransom from the world. So that's how Russia now positions itself vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
That's so critical. This idea that, it's why I named tonight's show Red Lines Over Ukraine, because Ukraine is, in fact, a big significant factor here. Of course, they're the ones that might be the victims of war here. But the reality of it is, what's really going on is a geopolitical dance between the West and Russia about whether democracy is going to maintain its dominance in the world, about whether Russia's, sort of more autocratic approach is going to get a toehold in the West in a real significant way. Michael, I've got a little bit more of a background to get to in a second here, but as you see the situation, you've been monitoring things in Ukraine for a very long time. How likely is it that there will be an attack on Ukraine?
Well, I see, in terms of likely, I see it in one sense as certain, because Russia has been attacking Ukraine and will continue to do so. So I think what we want to say is, will the nature of the attack change?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I always want to talk about what we're looking at now is an offensive. So will there be an offensive? For example, for comparison, 7 years ago right now, there was an offensive. It was in a part of the east of Ukraine around a city called Debaltseve. And the Russians eventually took that city. That was part of the invasion then. That was an offensive, but it was very constrained. And in fact, the result of that was the last territorial gain that Russia made in this war. That if, and it didn't happen, if the Ukrainian army had collapsed at that point, well, then Putin would not have stopped. He would have kept on going. And we'd be in the position we're in now, saying, oh, there might be a wider offensive and it will draw in other European countries. We would have been in that position 7 years ago if the Ukrainians had not had this tactical defeat but strategic victory by stopping the Russian invaders after Debaltseve, and that's been it. So you asked if it's likely they'll attack. I say yes, but the question is, what will the nature of the attack be? Now, what the Americans and others are looking at is, will this be a broad offensive, such as we have not seen in Europe since the Second World War? Armored infantry pouring across the Russian Federation and also Belarus border and this kind of thing? Or will it be more of the same, maybe augmented raids and not just the usual shelling, but an attempt to take some territory in the east of Ukraine? It will be one of those. And I think prudent measures by Western partners of Ukraine now can make sure that it does not become the worst result, which is a broad offensive, which would return us to, as Yevhen said, Yalta conditions. Actually, not Yalta, but before Yalta, when there was the war and it wasn't sure who was going to win.
Yeah, but the prospects, what we're saying is, he has already got quite a significant amount of influence in the eastern part of Ukraine. I mean, he's, as you point out, has taken 7% of territory already. A lot of the eastern part of Ukraine, it seems to have been softened up a little bit for any potential invasion. And more broadly than that, it seems unlikely that he'll want to disrupt such a big revenue stream for himself, which is the oil and gas revenue stream, which seems to go through Ukraine largely to Europe and other parts of the world. So, the incentive for him might not be that great to attack Ukraine. Is that an accurate assessment?
Well, I don't see him as having influence in these parts of Ukraine. It's occupation. So it's not. It's that he stole the land and holds the people there
hostage,
who remain captive. because there's 1.5 million internal refugees from this area. So, and if you look at east of Ukraine in general, well, then let's look at an area that he does not occupy, like Kharkiv. In fact, his influence there has declined dramatically. If you look at unoccupied Ukraine, so his question is, he's not winning hearts and minds in unoccupied Ukraine, and he's not going to succeed ever. In fact, it's going the other direction. And his
On the
only
surface of it all,
alternative,
Putin's strategy is ludicrous.
sorry,
He wants
sorry.
to
It
force
has
NATO,
failed.
the West, a deterrent against Russian aggression to stand down. That. Sorry about that. That shouldn't have played there. I was just trying to throw up the map, and that's what happens sometimes when I try to be proactive. But is this map accurate? You're looking at it right now. Does this show you this little section here in the red area? Or this,
yeah. We should add in Crimea because it has the same status. Right. It is invaded and occupied territory of Ukraine, now under occupation by the Russian Federation. So they really are the same in terms of their status, regardless of what the Putin regime calls it. But we're talking about occupied territory. And then so you look at the areas outside of them, they are no different in terms of the composition. We're talking about Ukrainian land, Ukrainian people, whether they speak Russian or call themselves Russian ethnics is not really the most important thing. These people are Ukrainians. One of the signs of Putin losing the hearts and minds battle that I've observed growing over the years is this remarkable phenomenon of Russian-speaking Ukrainian nationalists, which is not at all in tune with the sensibility that Russian propaganda presents it. And this will be familiar to American viewers, for example, because it's the idea of the melting pot, where they say, well, it doesn't matter where you come from and what language you speak, we're all Americans, the kind of idea. We uphold certain kinds of values. So there's this transcending idea of nationhood, which is actually, yes, Ukrainian is the state language, and that's a part of this kind of thing, but it's really a remarkable and modern thing about how Ukraine has emerged, and really this war has been a crucible for this emergence. So Putin's in a bind. He either has to have more of this occupied territory or he fails.
We're going to talk a lot more about that. I gave you a little preview of my little piece there, so I'm going to play it now that I've previewed it. And on the other side, we'll talk some more about why this really does have an impact on America. And particularly in this piece, I try to outline some of the similarities between the events that led up to the attack on Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine 8 years ago, and to what happened in 2016 in the United States. On the surface of it all, Putin's strategy is ludicrous. You see, he wants to force NATO, the West, a deterrent against Russian aggression, to stand down. And he's doing it by being extra aggressive. It sort of doesn't make sense. He knows that his aggression will result in the reaction he's getting. He knows that he'll be getting more troops along his borders and along the countries neighboring to Russia. So what he must be really doing is testing NATO's strength now that Washington is under new management. NATO appears somewhat unified, but appearances can be deceiving. Take a look at how European countries lined up when it came to backing a US decision to send arms to Estonia. Germany balked, but Spain and the Netherlands supported the move. Now, why did they support the move? It has everything to do with natural gas. It's easy to see that countries who rely more heavily on Russia for natural gas are more reluctant to support arming the Ukrainians. So if you look at the Netherlands, very little reliance on Russian gas. Look at Spain, very little reliance on Russian gas. But then on the other hand, Belarus, Poland, Germany, 29 to 39% there, rely on Russian gas an enormous amount. Russia has used its natural gas and oil supplies as an instrument of foreign policy for as long as they've had oil. They even used the same levers on the Koch family patriarch almost a century ago. So this is what we can expect of them. Oil and gas is, in fact, an extension of Kremlin policy. Now, oil and gas is not the only way Russia exerts soft power. They have another export. We might call it transnational organized crime. They might think of it as the oligarchy. Russian oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska and Konstantin Malofeev. Deripaska, in particular, was responsible for hiring this man, Paul Manafort, to engineer the election of one Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych was a disgraced local politician in Ukraine when his career was resurrected by Manafort and his deputy, a Russian operative named Konstantin Kilimnik. You see him there on the left of that picture with a blue shirt and red tie. Yanukovych ended up becoming the Ukrainian president. He and his cronies then emptied out the state treasury, and he escaped to Russia, where he remains today, after he was literally tossed out of power by the Maidan Revolution. Russia also uses cyber warfare, the same kind of warfare that they use in the United States, to sow confusion and division among Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east and the western-leaning part of Ukraine, which is more favorable to NATO. And that is how we got to Russia's attack on the eastern parts of Ukraine and Crimea 8 years ago. Now, if you're following along, the American narrative is not that dissimilar. In fact, if you look at Manafort, if you look at Kilimnik, if you look at all the other participants, it appears to me that we're following a pretty similar narrative. It's why it's so important that what happens in Ukraine reflects on what will happen in the future of American politics. So correct me, I'm sure I got some history wrong there. Either of you jump in and tell me. On the surface of it all, Putin's strategy is ludicrous. I don't want to give it up. He wants to tell me what I might have said wrong about the history there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when Putin attacks against Ukraine started back in 2014, we created Stop Fake and started to look more widely at what instruments Russia is using, like non-kinetic instruments, non-kinetic instruments of war, and disinformation was one of them. Cyber attacks were another. And we started to look, are those messages which disinformation is pushing for Ukraine, are they unique, or they can be very easily used in other places like Europe, United States? And the approaches we noticed are pretty much the same. So they are looking for any kind of divisions, or if they don't see any, they can easily create them. And this division of Ukraine you mentioned, and division to the east, allegedly pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, and then the west, was exactly created by Russian political consultants before Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. And since then, it became one of the technologies used in Ukraine. And basically, the spike of that happened in 2014 when they started to explain the war with that division. That
so it's very similar.
Absolutely.
To the idea of Republicans and the MAGA movement and Democrats, or the more democratic leaning part of the electorate. That really is a very similar division. Was created in the United States. Was also created in Ukraine.
Yeah, and very often we've seen that the same GRU or FSB people were involved in creation of those divisions. And even if they do not create those cracks in the society, they're just looking for them to make them bigger, to exploit them. And also they created a very huge machinery for disinformation, both in Ukraine and in the United States. We have RT over there. We have radio stations which were recently bought by Russians and which are available now in the United States. We have a lot of social media influence which amplifies all those ideological differences between people, and it helps a lot to what they want to achieve. So they really want to see division in the societies, and they want to play that line both in the United States, in Ukraine. They want to divide European countries, they want to divide Europe and the United States, and it works very well because we've seen not that many attempts to stop that. And with Russia, I'm always quoting Lenin, who said that when you're dealing with Bolsheviks, they're usually using their bayonet to get through something, and if they get to something kind of hard, they stop. But if they get to the mesh, they continue moving until they achieve their goal. So it's absolutely Leninist approach to dealing with the West, and so they're probing the grounds, it's a trial and error approach, but if they do not see defense against what they're doing, they're just kind of going up and up to the next level. And that's exactly what we see now with Putin. So as you rightly said, he's probing NATO, he's probing United States, how far he can be allowed to go with that.
Mm-hmm. Michael, I think of Yanukovych a lot like I think of Trump, and it's not just because of Manafort and Kalimnik and Gates who are there to prop up Yanukovych, but they're also there for Trump. Is that analogy, is that accurate?
Yes, it is, but I think what the important thing is, how do the Russians approach both of these men? What are they to them? And they both have exploited them as assets or as agents of influence. So it's not, oh, they're agents and they're paid, or they're, under the SVU or something like that. No, that's not the point. The point is that they are manipulable, because they're both they're both grifters is what they are, and they're easily manipulable. And to the Putin regime, they are agents of influence. And as such, it actually doesn't matter if they are effective. For example, if they're really good at helping Russia, the important thing is that they be chaotic and that they harm their own side with whatever influence that they've got. So, for example, as long as Yanukovych wasn't anti-Russia, and he withdrew Ukraine's application for membership to NATO. He foolishly signed an extensive lease to Sevastopol, and that was fine. It was just as long as it was eroding Ukraine, that was fine. And then when his level of theft was so outrageous, and ultimately he rejected the association agreement with the EU, and this also outraged Ukrainians, and then his position became untenable. Well, then he just wasn't worth supporting by Putin anymore, and he pulled him. So he was effective up to a point, and then he was just an agent of chaos, the Maidan massacre and this kind of thing. And then his last act was this appeal to Russia to invade Ukraine with a letter, and he was convicted in absentia of treason for that. And I think Trump is the same way to the Putin regime. You say, well, he wasn't very effective. He didn't get sanctions lifted. Yeah, but he also wasn't effective for the U.S. as an ally of Ukraine, for example, or realizing its interests there, or advancing the democratic agenda for democracy in the world. He was destructive of that. He was destructive of certainly political unity in the United States, exacerbating the the divide in political culture in the United States. The breakdown of consensus that had been a strength of American political culture for so long, I think people realize have been broken down, and he contributed to that. So you say, well, he wasn't so good for Russia. Yeah, but he was destructive for the United States, which is all the same to Putin.
Yevgeny, what do you think of that analogy? Do you think that Yanukovych and Trump have similarities?
Yeah, I actually happy you mentioned Yanukovych, because he epitomizes the corruption of post-Soviet elites, and that was the foundation for spreading Russian influence in a post-Soviet space, because it's like a common denominator. And why Russia became very unhappy with Ukraine, because they realized that Ukraine is changing, as it's changing to the better, and it become example of another reality which is possible to achieve. And of course, having Ukraine, besides non-corrupted, democratic, would be sending very wrong signals to Putin's constituency back in Russia. And that's one of the annoying moments for Putin. And that's why he was happy with Yanukovych, as well as he's happy with any other corruptioner around, because they can very easily find the common language. And for Ukraine, it was very, very important to get rid of all that and to start moving away from that. And we have kind of a tagline, away from Moscow, because Moscow it's like corruption international, and which epitomizes entire democratic society, anti-democratic corruption government. And they also try to spread this corruption outside to those countries which usually were boasting that they are absolutely free of corruption, including European countries. And we've seen some former European policymakers becoming on the payroll of Gazprom and other Russian state-run companies, doing errands for them and other things. So we see that this is effective. And that's why we now also see some voices coming from the West saying, well, probably, probably Putin is right and Ukraine is doing everything wrong. And sometimes, yes, those people just believe in that, but sometimes those people are just very well paid to promote that type of narratives around.
100%. You mentioned the corruption, and it seems incredibly corrosive. Michael, you're still there. Don't worry about it. We can hear you. I'll just get you back on camera in a second, but I just want to share some of these slides here. With this one man, Igor Kolomoisky, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, is an example of how so much of this corruption is spread from Ukraine to the United States. And it's not just because he's connected to people like Rudy Giuliani and these other two characters, Fruman and I can't remember the other one's name, but anyhow, they were, we were well familiar with that story because it was led up to the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. But he's also apparently quite a supporter of Zelensky, of the president there now, and that he's in fact a big financial backer of Zelensky. Now, Kolomoisky is not allowed in the United States anymore because of the criminal enterprises he ran in the United States. Especially in Ohio, there's been several reports and several investigations that have been launched because he's, corrupted entire cities, corrupted entire states. He's the biggest landlord in Cleveland, Ohio, I think, and because of that, he created a huge financial crisis in the real estate market there. There's also the fact that he was the owner of Privatbank, which is a Ukrainian bank, and he bilked, some say, the Ukrainians of $5.5 billion. Some of that money may have actually landed up being invested in the United States. But it shows you the corruption and the level of corruption that emerges when Kremlin rule arrives, and it certainly was the case with Kolomoisky and all the way into the spread of that into the United States when Donald Trump was the president here. That speaks a lot to the corruption you were talking about. I don't know if you have any specific comments about Kolomoisky or anything like that, but how influential is he in your world?
Well, when Zelensky was elected a president, Ukrainian society gave him a huge credit of confidence, and one of the biggest expectations was that he would distance himself from oligarchs, and he picked up this expectation and was trying to deliver it and saying that, yeah, I really want to not to be involved with oligarchy, and even what we saw can be called war against oligarchs, but again, we can argue a lot how effective it was. Either it was just a rhetorical approach to that, or is he really doing that and distancing himself from people like Kolomoisky or any other. But speaking on behalf of Ukrainian society, I can say that we really don't want to see Ukraine being associated with oligarchs and corruption, because that's really created a problem for Ukraine for many, many years. And again, it was exploited by people in Kremlin. They've been saying that Ukraine is not a real country, it's a failed state because it's run by oligarchs and actually supported by them in many cases, but they used it against Ukraine all the time, denying the agency to Ukraine and to Ukrainian people. And now when we follow Russian disinformation, they immediately try to portray it as one of the biggest downsides of Ukraine, sell it around like Ukraine is a hotbed of corruption. Mm-hmm. And
but in fact, they're the ones inspiring it. They're the ones supporting the corruption. The Kremlin is the ones who are in fact making it easy. And we've seen it with the Pavel Fuchs. We've seen it with so many, people who are of, they're Russian in terms of the fact that they were born in the Soviet Union when the Ukrainians were still under Soviet rule, but they spent a lot of time in Pavel Fuchs's case in Russia, and he appears to be an agent of Russian intelligence, or at least influence, who knows. But he seems to take orders from the Kremlin in terms of the things that he does, and that again continues to underline the amount of corruption that seems to emerge from Ukraine, but doesn't necessarily. And all of that stuff seems to somehow connect to Rudy Giuliani, because whenever you look in the world of Ukraine, Rudy Giuliani seems to show up somehow. Whether it's the Parnas Furman combination or Fruman combination or whatever. There's just a lot of Rudy when it comes to Ukraine. Do either of you have any comments about Rudy and about why he's so prominent in Ukrainian affairs?
Well, I'd say he's actually not prominent in Ukrainian affairs. He's prominent in Russian corruption, because when people say, "Oh, Rudy Giuliani went to Ukraine and met with Ukrainian oligarchs," what he's doing is acting as a cutout. He's a go-between, and as are these people he's meeting. So you look at these figures, and they're minor figures, and I'm thinking about people like Artemenko, who's just a minor pro-Russian deputy, or he was, and he's a nobody. And in a way, Giuliani's a nobody too. But what they are is a way to have the corruption of the Putin regime connect into the seats of power in Washington. Because if they can cook up a scheme which they present as a peace plan, but was really a surrender Crimea plan, which is what they did, it serves Putin. So I think if we focus too much on these figures, they're not decision makers, they're cutouts. And say what's the nature of what they're talking about and what they're achieving. It's a way to communicate. When Giuliani made a trip in 2017, and he goes to Kharkiv, and he's there meeting like the mayor of Kharkiv, who deceased now. He was a pro-Russian figure. He says, "Well, what's going on here? Like, why is Rudy Giuliani meeting with the mayor of a city in eastern Ukraine?" And that wasn't what it was about. It was a connection. It was between the Putin regime and the Trump administration is what was going on.
For sure, a very significant one. I want to remind our viewers that they can comment, and we'll take those comments to the air. If they go to narrative.org/TV, that's narrativ.org/TV, and in that chat room, you can write your comments, and we'll take those to the air, and any questions you have for Yevgen or Michael, we'll ask away. Yevgen, the prognosis right now is that the Biden administration has promised that there'll be more forces potentially sent to support Ukraine, but some people are saying that it's in fact America that's making the tension increase, and that's mostly a Russian talking point, or a Zelensky talking point. I can't tell the difference. But are people on the ground there feeling like America is contributing to the tension?
No, just the opposite. At the very beginning, I was saying that compared to 2014, now we feel a lot of international support, and support coming from the United States is actually one of those strong signals which we believe might deter Putin and Russia from further aggression and further incursion. Because, for example, today Ukraine received a plane load of arms. And that's important both from tactical point of view, because those armaments would be delivered to the front line at some point, but also it's important from a symbolic point of view. So it clearly sends a signal to Putin that Ukraine is not left alone. And that's exactly what he wanted to see. So he really wanted to see Ukraine being isolated, again, as I said, because of corruption, because of failed state, as he described it, because he always was saying that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. So when he sees that the United States are supporting, and by the way, this support is absolutely bipartisan, coming from both parties, and today we've seen also a huge delegation from both parties, from Congress living for Ukraine to have a first-hand assessment of the situation on the ground. So that sends a very, very strong signal of support. And of course, I've seen some voices saying that when the United States are helping Ukraine with arms, with diplomatic support, they are contributing to the tension. Just the opposite, they're contributing to the non-military settlement, because weapons, for example, which are provided to Ukraine, they are defensive weapons. Ukraine cannot use it for offensive, as some people are saying that Ukraine is going to use it against Russian forces in Russia, for example. And so that's absolutely kind of a wrong approach, and it's a false moral equivalency when people are saying that here both Ukraine and Russia are kind of share responsibility for this conflict and tension and other things. So just let me be clear here: Ukraine is defending its right to existence. And if other countries are supporting this with political steps, diplomatic support, and also Ukraine is now asking different countries to provide arms, that's helping Ukraine to defend itself. And we are saying, and the rest, and we would do the rest. So we are not asking anyone to come and to do the actual fighting instead of us. But we would do that, but please do support us. And believe me, every signal sent to Putin is very well received over there and analyzed and assessed. And every plane load of armaments coming to Kiev these days can delay or postpone or abort further Russian incursion into Ukraine. So every piece of equipment is counted.
Such an
Yeah,
important
I agree
message.
with that completely. That it reduces tension. Absolutely. The way I look at it, Ukrainians are going to fight for themselves no matter what, whether we help them or not. And that's been proven. And if all they have is a submachine gun, that's what they're going to do. But if they have a Javelin missile, that is a greater likelihood at success at destroying that tank, which is in their country, invading them. So, and every delivery, like the delivery today, does give Putin pause and makes it less likely that he will join the offensive. It is far more likely that a Ukrainian with a Javelin missile launcher is going to destroy a Russian tank than with a submachine gun. They're not going to do that, right? But they're likely to with that. And these are defensive weapons. And we know that Putin takes notice. For example, military analysts have been sending me this information. They've shown me how the Russians are jerry-rigging a defense on their tanks, because most of their tanks are actually quite old and not modern. And they've been welding a superstructure on top of it to make the explosive of a top-down missile explode away from the tank. And they've kitted hundreds of their tanks with this, the tanks that are now deployed at the border. But it's actually not 100% defense either. The missile is going to hit. It is still going to do substantial damage and probably kill the crew and quite likely disable the tank. And it makes it less effective a weapon. And so every missile like the ones delivered today makes it less likely that Putin will make the decision and says, "Oh, we're going to roll the tanks."
That's really interesting.
Because the cost, he knows, will be very much higher.
So the arms that are arriving in Ukraine are very effective, both as a deterrent, but also because it'll give the Ukrainians the weapons they need to fight, should they need to fight, which hopefully they won't.
But the point is, they're going to fight anyway with whatever weapons they have.
Right,
and this
right.
means, so we're making a decision when we're doing this. Are we going to have them fight poorly or well? That is the decision we're making. And it is in our interest that they do it well, because if they do it well, the Russians don't succeed and the invasion battlefront doesn't get closer to us.
Right.
I mean, people in Western Europe and further on.
I mean, this notion that...
Exactly. If I can jump on this,
of course,
and add one more thing. I totally agree with Michael, because Putin's war is not going to end on Ukraine. So if Ukraine would be weak, and if Ukraine would fall, they would move on to the Eastern European countries, and our neighbors know that very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we see more and more support coming from countries like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Czechia, because we have a shared experience of Soviet occupation. We know how it starts, how it looks when it starts, and how dramatically it ends with people killed, moved to Gulag, and disappearing forever. So for us, these lessons are very well learned. And so the people in Western Europe also should remember when Eastern Europe would fall, they would be the next, because if Russian tanks would not be stopped by javelins in Ukraine, they would move on. And during the 2014 stage of the war, there was a very famous internet meme with a Russian tank standing in front of Eiffel Tower in Paris, and the saying was, yesterday Luhansk, it's in eastern Ukraine, and tomorrow Paris. And actually, I don't see any obstacles for that.
Or even Alaska,
there would be no Ukraine.
Yeah, Alaska Nash.
Alaska
is ours.
Yeah. So a couple of points from people. Stacy says that's a very good point. Putin won't stop at Ukraine. Well, yes, indeed. That seems almost certain. Marie says that Dugin wants a Eurasian Union. Similar point. I don't know if Dugin is still the guy that they're looking to for their guidance, but it could be. An upstate farmer says, we've slipped down that slippery slope before, and it does not turn out well for anyone. Must defend democracy. Any comments on those from you gentlemen, on those comments?
Yeah, I would say I would totally agree. Democracy should be defended, because Putin sees democracy as a danger for himself, and he is ready to go too far now to make democracy at least looking weak, or to fail. And that would be very, very dramatic changes, which would happen everywhere in the world. And basically, I am following Russian media 24 hours a day, and I can say that the conversations they conduct over there, they are absolutely bringing us to the times of, for example, genocide in Rwanda. So, for example, on a talk show, they're discussing how they're going to kill Ukrainians, for example, or how Russia is going to nuke the United States, and how many cities in the United States would be destructed by nuclear weapons. And that's a kind of a new normalcy. So it's not something outstanding. They're really seriously discussing that. And that is happening 24 hours a day on all main Russian TV channels. So it's a normalization of the killing of Ukrainians, for example, based on our ethnicity. So it's absolutely...
Sorry, but is that geared to... Why are they doing that? Is that for the Russian population to feel like they will want to go and commit these crimes? Or is it just a sort of a nationalism that they're trying to build up?
Yeah, so they basically militarize the mindset of their own people, and it happens again since 2014. So to make sure that the concept of the Russia's war against everyone is not new to the Russian society. Russian society is susceptible to that idea, and is not afraid for ramifications. For example, they're saying that we don't care about sanctions if they would put on us. We don't care about anything because we are a superpower. We have armaments, and we can solve any problem with that. So it's not a time for dialogue, as they say. So there would be no negotiations. So it's absolutely kind of a revanchist approach, revanchist rhetorics. And it looks very scary to me, because I am really very interested in history, and I was looking into Hitler in Germany, and I see a lot of parallels in this rhetorics, which is now happening in Russia. I see the same overtones in how they explain what they're doing and why they're doing, and it looks very, very dangerous to me.
Absolutely.
And I like, Yevhen, how you made that comparison to the Rwanda genocide, because someone from outside would look at that and say, how could radio have such influence? But it did in Rwanda. That was how people got the information. It was totally dominated by one side with this language of hate, and it led to this horrific genocide. Now, in Russia, you might say, oh, it's a modern country and people have the internet and so on. But as you know, it's television. And it's television that people watch and pay attention to. And it's lying to them and stoking up this hatred and fear just nonstop. And it does have the historical parallels. It is projecting Ukrainians not just as an enemy, but as subhuman, as an ethnic class that needs to be exterminated. And it does lead to the worst possible result.
That's interesting. You raised some interesting points there. As Upstate Farmer says, radio has immense influence in the United States as well, pointing to Sinclair and I don't know, FEH.
Yeah. So
And
we shouldn't
also,
underestimate that. Yeah.
and also, in World War II, it had an influence here in Arizona with the Council for National Policy, inspired evangelical radio in the rural areas too. Radio is still very powerful. It certainly seems like that's an interesting theme that you've placed down there. One of the the overarching themes that keeps coming up in the chat here is how nervous and scary it is that the same elements that infected Ukraine from Russia have also infected American politics and American society. From your perspective, Yevhen, how do you suggest that Americans combat this, very toxic, cancerous kind of influence that has arrived from Russia in America?
So I can share kind of a Ukrainian perspective, what we've done. So after 2014, for example, Ukrainian television regulator banned Russian TV channels, which were fully available here before 2014. We had more than 80 TV channels available. Mm-hmm. And you would not believe, but all of them were weaponized. Even if those TV channels were doing children programming or music or movies, it all became propaganda. So the Ukrainian Ofcom regulator took them off air, and that was absolutely the right decision. And also subsequently, Russian social media were sanctioned, like Vkontakte VK. And Telegram is another place where there is a lot of disinformation, and probably government should look into regulating that. And also the access to some Russian propagandist websites were limited. And that's important because we cannot just realize that the audiences are smart and they would decide by themselves what is great and what is malign and what is disinformation. So definitely there should be regulation. Another important issue is deplatforming. So we really do not need to provide platform to disinformation voices. And it's also should involve cooperation with social media companies. Another important issue, and we really started to work on this, is sanctioning of those people who are involved in manufacturing of this hate speech and disinformation. And as far as I know, there is a draft of act in US Senate, which in case of the further incursion, there would be sanctions on the main people involved in Russian disinformation. And this is really very, very important point, because those people have personal responsibility for all this hate speech and warmongering they've been producing for years and years and years, and they definitely should be sanctioned. And also it's important to withdraw advertising from those platforms and TV channels which distribute disinformation and hate speech and populism, because then commercial entities are subsidizing disinformation alongside with Russian government, for example, if we talk about Russian media. So, and last but not least, we should understand finally that in Russia there is no traditional media system as we have in Ukraine, in the United States, in Canada. So the media system was absolutely destroyed by the government, and the same with the civil society. So basically, there is no any checks and balances within Russian society. There is no political parties, movements, NGOs, media. So basically, the government now has their dominating role over society, and what is happening is a brainwashing of the society in the most brutal way, and preparing the society for the Great War, as they call it. And if we would not take any kind of actions against this, we would not be able to stop this, because if we would only look at the kinetic part of the war, that's only a part of the reality. As I mentioned, there is other parts to this, like cyber war, and Ukraine was attacked just last week on the cyber domains. There is disinformation. There are people of influence Russia is using. We also discussed that. So kind of there are multiple layers how you can tackle all those problems, but the time is running out. So we really
it's interesting. I just want to, if I could just jump in there for 1 second, because America, the American situation is a little different, because it's not just foreign media coming from Russia. It's not just RT. It seems that they've taken over Fox News, which is the #1 news network in America. It seems that they've taken over Newsmax. It seems that they have this other network called OAN, which is these are American networks, or at least they appear to be American networks. But somehow, whether it's through the management or ownership or secret funding or whatever, these networks have become disinformation sources for the Russian government, including in the issue of Ukraine, where there's some of Americans are out there saying that they support Russia in the attack on Ukraine, because Fox News and Tucker Carlson keep pushing that line. And this is the #1 news network in the United States. What do you think we should do with that?
Yeah, Michael, please.
Well, to put it in the American context, you see, Yevhen mentioned sanctioning these individuals. And a difficulty with the United States is, well, the United States has the First Amendment and freedom of speech is protected. And as long as these organizations can say, oh, we're journalists and our organizations are exercise of free speech, it's going to be a problem. But sanctions is the right approach. So let's take an example. The head of RT, what's her name?
Simonian.
Margarita Simonian, yes.
She is, that person is a threat to U.S. national security. She is a threat and should be sanctioned for the grave risk she poses to international peace and security, which is the criteria of imposing sanctions. Well, she heads this organization, which is an influence organization, which poses a threat to U.S. national security. And so this is the way you can do it. It's not a question of free speech and journalism. She's not a journalist. RT is not a news outlet kind of thing. And
but Tucker Carlson is an American. You're going to sanction Tucker Carlson? You can't.
Okay. So how do we stop his Russian influence operation? Why is he doing? Who is he connected to? What is the influence that leads him to platform Russian propaganda on his channel? So who are those people? What are those entities? What makes him the agent of influence for aggressor Russia that he is? And so you go after those people, and it's like wrapping up organized crime, right? You can't go after the big boss originally or the most influential, but you find the bag man and you find the hitman and you turn them and you roll up the operation. And that's the way to approach it, like the way we deal with organized crime.
Absolutely. You have got anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, I totally agree with Michael. They are not a real media organization, so probably we really need to rethink the whole concept of media. Who is media today, and who are the real journalists, and who are those who are masquerading as journalists to use the First Amendment as an excuse to promote their disinformation, hate speech, and other things. So it's kind of a freedom of speech versus freedom of reach, which is also kind of a concept which is now getting more and more traction around within media community. So who can get a reach? Yes, you can have your right to express your views, but what platforms can be used for
That's
that?
interesting. I haven't heard that concept
This
before.
can be
Freedom of
limited
reach.
and
I like that.
rewired, yeah.
Interesting.
And also another thing that is they are not really journalists. So that's what I was arguing since 2014. And we should never, sit on the same panel with them, in discussing the virtues of freedom of speech and journalism, because they are basically killing journalism by masquerading as journalism, because that kills the trust to you as a journalist, to me as a journalist, and people trust them less and less because they're saying, oh, there is no truth, it's all relative, there is this truth, and then there is alternative truth and other things. So we definitely should limit this concept to that there is only one truth, Yeah, probably there is no complete objectivity, but the truth is absolutely well defined, and we should know exactly who is telling the truth, and who is just pretending and saying, yes, we're also media, but they're not.
Right. This is a good question. Julia says, and we'll wrap up with this one, but why does Putin want to invade Ukraine now? Why didn't he do it when Trump was in office? It just doesn't seem like a very opportune time. That's a very good point. This isn't that the ideal time. 2 years ago would have been ideal. Why didn't he do it then?
Well, because who's in office in the White House isn't the deciding factor for Putin. He actually is very local in his perspective, and what happens in Ukraine is more important, actually. So if we look at, he did invade 8 years ago, and it went well, but only up to a point. And then the kind of more static war that he's been fighting ever since has not turn things in his favor. So it's more because of what's happening in Ukraine or not happening in Ukraine from Putin's point of view that is the deciding factor. And he would have liked maybe if conditions were
different,
more favorable, like when in Trump's office, but it really isn't the most important thing to him.
Yevgen?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess he was waiting and looking if Zelensky would really be more pro-Russian leader of Ukraine compared to Poroshenko. And that was kind of their feelings as soon as Zelensky was elected as a president. So they
want to give it time.
Zelensky being in power was also a delaying
and then
factor.
At some point, Putin said, I don't see any difference between Zelensky and Poroshenko. They are both anti-Russian. And from that point, he decided definitely to move forward because he see how Ukraine is slipping off Russian sphere of influence. So he doesn't have, he started to have less and less leverage over Ukraine. So he doesn't have Russian media, he doesn't have too many Russian oligarchs, he doesn't have Russian gas now in Ukraine, he doesn't have a lot of politicians in Ukrainian parliament who can be described as pro-Russian politicians. And Ukraine started to be more self-aware as an independent state, building its own institutions, civil society, army, diplomacy, and other things. And at some points, Russian politicians were saying, we are losing Ukraine. If we would not do something in a year, 2, 3 from now, Ukraine is just gone because it becomes a very different, very separate country.
Well, is Poroshenko back? He seems to be in the news lately. Is he attempting a comeback of some sort?
Yeah, I mean, he was always around, and they were competing with Zelensky kind of neck to neck in terms of their electoral support. And he has a very vital political party, active in parliament, outside of the parliament. And so he is quite a factor in Ukrainian domestic politics. And at some point, even those people who've been following Zelensky's struggle with Poroshenko said that probably Zelensky is even more worried about Poroshenko coming back rather than afraid of Putin.
Mm.
And that's described kind of their domestic infight between two of them. But that's good. It describes Ukrainian domestic political scene as a live, and real when politicians are competing with each other. And
Which is
that's
good.
what you would not see in Russia, for
Yeah,
example.
absolutely. That means democracy is working there. Yevgen, everyone here I know is thinking, even though we focus so much on American politics as it relates to Ukraine, we're all with you in this fight, and there's enormous solidarity, I think, from everybody who is watching this show, and our hearts are with you and our minds are with you, and we wish you all the best. We don't think conflict is coming in great amounts in the near future. We hope not, but certainly our best wishes to you and to every Ukrainian who is at least in this moment still having fear in their hearts as they approach a potential attack from Russia. I also want to give you an opportunity to talk about your organization, so our viewers can follow it. So please go ahead and tell people about stopfake.org.
Yes, so as I said, back in 2014, we created stopfake.org. It's a fact-checking organization which is following Russian disinformation mainly, but we also are very active with COVID-19. We work also with Facebook as a third-party verification partner. And since 2014, we made a couple of most important things. So we defined who are the main players within Russian disinformation. We mapped their main narratives which they promote, and we also debunked all those things. And you can find that all on our website, which is also available in English. So that provided opportunity to compare Ukraine experience to experience of other countries, including countries of Eastern and Central Europe, which is very similar, as I said. And that's why I really advise you to follow us also on Twitter for the latest updates on disinformation, Ukraine. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you so much. And your Twitter account is Yevgen Fichenko, as it's written on the screen now without the space. And stopfake.org, is that the name of the...
Stop Faking News. It's Stop Faking News.
In news, okay. Stop Fake News, is that right? Or in news?
Stop Faking News. So it's our appeal to the audience. Stop faking news.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure I post it alongside this, the rest of the show. Thank you so much, Yevgen, for being on the show tonight. And Michael McKay, tell everyone how they can reach you. You have a Twitter account handle that's always difficult for me to remember. So even though it's only 5 letters.
Yeah, just letters. It's at MHMCK.
Okay.
So I just put.
And Michael has a terrific feed. Everyone should follow both of your feeds. Michael's feed in particular has a really good chronicle of what's going on in Ukraine. It has been persistent for the last few years, and it's been very helpful to me and to the other people in our audience to follow what's going on in Ukraine. And with that, let's say goodnight or early morning to you, Yevgen. Thank you so much for staying up so late. We really appreciate that, and hopefully we'll have you back on the show. Thank you very much. So good night to you, Yevgen, and good night, Michael. And we'll see everyone back here tomorrow night on Narrative Live. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye.
Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.